Jimmy Chin and a National Geographics team were returning from Everest in late September 2024 when they made a shocking discovery. As Jimmy would go on to say, "We were all literally running in circles dropping F-bombs." This find has been compared to the search for Amelia Earhart or Michael Rockefeller, and it gives us some small clues into the greatest mountain climbing mystery of all time. Today we cover tragedy, mystery, and the weird role of global warming to give us the answers we've been looking for in the past 100 years. As always, viewer discretion is advised. It all started in the early years of World War I. What began as a regional conflict has exploded into the deadliest battle mankind has ever seen. Both Allied and Central powers are locked in a brutal struggle to gain any edge they can. And with warplanes just making their debut, aviation looks like the only way to surprise the enemy and shift the tides. The Germans were quick to act on this. They developed a revolutionary synchronization device. It allowed them to mount heavy machine guns on aircraft that could fire precisely between the rotating propeller blades without shredding their own planes. It was a game changer, letting them unleash a deadly rain of bullets on both ground troops and enemy planes. The Allies were left scrambling, hoping to find something to even the odds. Soon enough, they'd get what they were looking for. One random day in the year 1915, the British War Office in Birkenhead, Cheshire, received an unexpected envelope. Inside were two detailed designs that caught their attention. One was the blueprint for a synchronization device of their own, and the other suggested a design for a gyroscopic stabilizer to steady aircraft and improve precision in combat maneuvers. Though the designs intrigued everyone, the person behind them was even more shocking. It wasn't a military genius or an aviation expert, but a teenage boy with an unusual talent for mechanics. Andrew Irvine, better known to his family as Sandy. While there is no record of the British forces using Sandy's designs directly, their innovation hinted at his extraordinary potential. This was a child destined for something extraordinary. A fate that, as it would turn out, was both brilliant and heartbreakingly brief. Over 100 years before Jimmy Chin's shocking discovery on Mount Everest, Sandy Irvine's extraordinary life began. Born in Birkenhead in 1902, Sandy was a naturally curious and hands-on child from day one. His father, William Ferguson Irvine, was a historian, but unlike his dad's love for library shelves and academic lectures, Sandy took after his mother's mechanical interests. She was ahead of her time, having designed a washing machine prototype before World War I. Since his childhood, books weren't exactly Sandy's best friends, probably because he had a learning issue like dyslexia that no one really picked up on. But give him numbers or an engine to fix, and he'd blow everyone away. He was the kind of kid who'd take things apart just to see if he could put them back together, leaving a trail of parts around the house that drove his mom up the wall. But deep inside, she always knew there was something special about him. Sports were his other big thing. A few years after his innovative plane design stunned many, he gained attention again as a standout rower, playing a key role in an impressive Royal Shrewsbury School Boat Club victory. Just 2 years later, he got into Merton College, Oxford, to study engineering, and finally started making strides academically. He also joined the Oxford University Mountaineering Club and the rowing crew, helping Oxford pull off a rare win in the 1923 Oxford-Cambridge boat race, which was the only win Oxford had in 3 decades. Later that year, he joined the Merton College Arctic expedition to Spitsbergen, which marked a turning point in his life. Sandy became the highlight of the trip, excelling in every aspect and quickly earning a reputation for his ability to stay productive and resourceful, especially when it came to handling equipment in tough conditions. The leader of this expedition was a geologist and mountaineer, Noel Odell. When Sandy met him, they quickly realized they'd actually crossed paths before. 4 years earlier, Noel and his wife Mona were on a trekking trip to a 3,000-foot mountain in Wales called Fôl Grach. There they had a brief run-in with Sandy, when he surprised them by riding his motorcycle up to the top, while they had hiked up on foot. So, when Noel saw Sandy again, he didn't want to miss the chance, and he immediately invited him to join the upcoming British Mount Everest expedition. In his recommendation to the organizing team, Noel described the 21-year-old as a big, strong guy with broad shoulders and light legs. He even called him a Superman, thinking he'd be a huge asset to the campaign. Noel himself was the oxygen officer for the British Mount Everest expedition and had already been part of earlier attempts to conquer the mountain. By 1924, this was Britain's third try to reach the summit of the world's highest peak. The first two attempts in 1921 and 1922 didn't get anywhere, and the second one even left the financial blow of around $3,000, which, if you adjust for inflation, was like burning through $56,000 today. That loss forced the organizing team to delay the third expedition for an entire year, but when they finally returned in 1924, they were determined to plant their flag on top of the world this time. Climbing Everest back then wasn't anything like the modern-day adventure it's become. Forget the fancy gear or mapped-out trails. This was pure exploration. The mountain itself was uncharted territory, and the now standard southern pathway wasn't even an option, because it cut through Nepal, which at the time was off-limits to Westerners due to political restrictions. That left the north face of the mountain as the only viable way up. However, it was a track mountaineers describe as one where a single slip could mean certain death. To take on this challenging climb and establish a route, the expedition team had brought in a man known for his unmatched strength and a poetic obsession with Everest, George Mallory. George sharpened his climbing skills while working as a schoolteacher, but the outbreak of World War I forced him to put his passion for the mountains on hold. After coming back from the war, he tried returning to teaching but quickly realized it wasn't for him anymore. So, when the chance to join the first ever British expedition to Everest came knocking in 1921, he quit his job immediately and went all in on his dream. During that first expedition, George and his team mapped out the main route to the summit through the North Col and North Ridge. The following year, on the second expedition, they made history by climbing to a staggering 27,300 feet, using supplemental oxygen, and even got Olympic gold medals for alpinism. Like Noel, George was on his third expedition and came fully prepared, with all the right skills for the job. Along with him, Noel, and Sandy, the team had 12 members and 60 porters to help them get to the top. On February 29, 1924, George left Liverpool for the Himalayas on a ship, joined by 3 other expedition members, including Sandy. By the end of March, everyone was finally at the prep camps and the journey to Everest kicked off. They followed the same route to the base of the mountain as before, taking another month to acclimatize and adjust along the way. By April 29th, they made it to base camp at the glacier end of the Rongbuk Valley. The conditions had been pretty decent up until that point, but as soon as they arrived, snow and bad weather moved in. After settling in, the team planned their camp locations. Back then, climbers had to build each camp as they went, and the spots they used were different from what we see today. George mapped out their route, planning to hit camps 1, 2, and 3 after leaving base camp, with a goal of reaching the North Col checkpoint at 23,000 feet, where they'd set up Camp 4 just below it. From there, they'd break into smaller groups and try to summit over several days. By the first week of May, the expedition reached the location for Camp 3, but the weather turned and a heavy snowstorm stopped them in their tracks. Once it cleared up a bit, they finally made it to Camp 4 by May 21st. But the weather went south again, and some of the porters and team members got sick and had to head back to Camp 1. In that situation, they gave 15 of the strongest and most skilled porters the title of Tigers to lift their spirits and get them ready for the toughest part of the climb. The 1922 British expedition marked the first time supplemental oxygen was used in mountaineering. However, because it was a new attempt, they ran into some issues with the process. Experts worked on these issues over the next 2 years and brought improved equipment for this expedition. But still, the gear wasn't very reliable, and not everyone in the group agreed on whether to use it. Sandy quickly became a resource in this situation. He made some big improvements to the oxygen sets, making them lighter, stronger, and easier to use, all while keeping an eye out for repairs. He also looked after the expedition's cameras, camp beds, stoves, and other gear. In just a few days, the 21-year-old undergrad became well-liked and respected by his older and much more experienced teammates. George Mallory even joked to his wife that Sandy could handle just about anything, except maybe a conversation. After about a week at Camp 4, George and his fellow climber, John Jeffrey Bruce, decided to make the first summit attempt of the expedition on June 1st. Their plan was to leave Camp 4, set up Camps 5 and 6 along the way, and then push for the summit before heading back to Camp 4 again, because it was safer there with giant ice walls shielding them from extreme winds. With 9 Tiger porters by their side and hopes for clear weather, the team set out to conquer the peak. But as soon as they left the shelter of Camp 4 walls, fierce, icy winds hit them hard along the ridges. They had to respond to the circumstances. 4 of the 9 porters abandoned their loads and turned back before they even reached the spot for Camp 5. Despite this setback, George and Bruce kept going and eventually set up Camp 5 at 25,200 feet. But the next day, things only got worse. 3 more porters refused to continue because of the intense conditions, and the entire team had to turn back halfway up to their planned spot for Camp 6 at 26,800 feet. On their way back, George and John ran into 2 other team members, Edward Norton and Howard Somerville, who were just beginning their summit attempt. Edward and Howard climbed without supplemental oxygen, accompanied by 6 Tiger porters. But when they saw George and John returning unsuccessful, they started to question their own chances. At first, things went smoothly for them, but after setting up Camp 6, Howard started feeling seriously ill, forcing Edward to go on alone. He reached a new world record altitude of 28,126 feet, coming just 900 feet from the summit, before he had to turn back due to extreme exhaustion. While this was a new record in altitude, the summit attempt had still failed. But the climbers weren't ready to give up. And with time running out before the monsoon snows, the team only had one more shot at the summit. So they decided to send their best men for the job, and George was once again the obvious choice. He needed a partner for the summit, and while everyone expected him to pick Noel Odell, George made the surprising call to choose Sandy instead. The exact reason for this choice is still unclear, but experts think George might have believed that if the previous attempt had used supplemental oxygen, they would have reached the top. So, not only did he decide to use oxygen this time, but he also picked Sandy for his expertise with the equipment. Whatever the reason, George and Sandy set off for their summit attempt on June 6th at 8:40 a.m., along with 8 porters. By the end of the next day, they had made it to Camp 6, ready for their final push. Noel Odell was playing a supporting role, so he took a photo of George and Sandy before they left. That photo ended up being the last close-up picture of them alive. On June 7th, Noel went to Camp 5 where some porters who had helped George and Sandy at Camp 6 came back with 2 handwritten notes, one for him and the other for the photographer John Noel. The note to him included their usual whereabouts, while the letter to the photographer mentioned that if the weather was good, he might be able to catch a shot of George and Sandy either crossing the rock band under the pyramid or heading up the skyline by 8 a.m. the next day. John was told to keep an eye on that area with the camera ready from the lookout he had set up at Camp 3. The next morning, John remained at the camera and telescope from 8 a.m. until 10 a.m., 2 hours after they were supposed to reach the spot. Even though the weather was clear, he didn't see them. After 10 a.m., a sudden whiteout blocked the view, and he couldn't see anything anymore. Meanwhile, up around 26,000 feet, Noel was scanning the ridge too, hoping to catch sight of George and Sandy. Around 12:50 p.m., he climbed over a rocky ledge and spotted them as 2 tiny black dots making their way along a snowy trail beneath a steep section of the ridge. One dot seemed to move toward the other. When the first dot reached the top of the ridge, Noel wasn't sure if the second one made it up too. Noel wrote in his diary, "Saw M. G. Mallory and I, A. Irvine, on the ridge, nearing base of final pyramid." That simple statement later became the biggest point of controversy in this entire expedition, turning what should have been a straightforward observation into a mystery that had people arguing for decades. Noel couldn't pin down exactly where he'd seen them. At first, he said by base of the final pyramid, he meant they were near the third step, which is remarkably high up on the mountain and close to the summit. But his fellow climbers weren't so sure they could have made it that far so quickly. So, Noel changed his story and said they were actually near the second step, which was a bit lower, but one of the hardest and time-consuming spots to get past on the ridge. So his account was still a bit of a stretch. Over the years, he revised his statement multiple times, eventually suggesting they might have been at the first step, maybe even on their way back down. Just before he passed away in 1987, he admitted that he'd never been sure of the exact spot where he saw those moving figures. But how did this uncertainty impact the climbers' fate? The worsening weather was a more immediate concern, with George and Sandy already 5 hours behind schedule. After waiting anxiously, Noel decided to head up to Camp 6 himself, only to find it destroyed by the relentless snowstorm. He searched as best he could in those severe conditions, but he couldn't find any trace of the climbers. By evening, he had no choice but to head back to Camp 4. The next day, he returned with 2 porters to keep looking, but it was hopeless. The snow seemed to have swallowed both men. After hours of searching with no luck, it was clear that the storm had wiped out any chance of their survival. With no other options, Noel had to call off the search, marking the end of yet another failed Everest expedition, but this time, leaving behind a trail of questions that still remain unanswered, even after a century. What happened to them up there? Did they fall, freeze to death, get caught in a storm? Where exactly did they end up? And most important of them all, did they actually reach the summit and die on the way down? Or did Everest stop them before they could make history? The only way to find out was to locate their bodies. They had carried a camera with them, hoping to snap a photo if they reached the top. So if they were ever found, that camera might finally tell their story. Over the years, search parties came and went, scaling the mountain, hoping to uncover even the smallest trace of them. But it wasn't until 9 years later that the first clue finally surfaced. During the 1933 British expedition, a team came across an abandoned ice axe just below the ridge near the first step. The Swiss manufacturer's name on the axe matched the ones given to the 1924 expedition team. Since only George and Sandy had reached that height in 1924, it was likely one of theirs. George's wife couldn't identify it, so they assumed it belonged to Sandy. The expedition leader thought it looked like the scene of an accident. He believed this could be where one or both of the climbers slipped and fell, thinking it was probably the highest point they'd reached before things went wrong. However, Noel wasn't buying that theory. He thought they might have left the axe behind on purpose to pick it up on the way back, since the next part of the climb was mostly rock and didn't require an ice axe. The next big sighting came 3 years later, during another British Mount Everest expedition. English mountaineer Frank Smythe was scanning Everest's north face with a powerful telescope from base camp. That's when he spotted something that he thought was the body of either George or Sandy. But he kept it to himself for a year, worried the press would blow it all out of proportion. Fast forward to May 29, 1953, when Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay Sherpa made history as the first people to actually stand on top of Everest. By then, George and Sandy's attempt was widely believed to have failed, but the search for their bodies kept going. For the next 2 decades, things were quiet. Then in 1975, Chinese mountaineer Wang Hongbao had a breakthrough. At 26,575 feet, he spotted a body and immediately recognized it as an English mountaineer, just from the clothes. He gave a detailed location, saying it was about a 20-minute walk from Camp 6. This was the closest anyone had gotten to finding them, but somehow, it took almost 11 more years before the first Mallory and Irvine research expedition was launched in 1986, based on this lead. Bad weather shut down that attempt too before the team could even make any real progress. Then nearly 4 years later, in May of 1991, an American mountain guide named Eric Simonson was out on Everest when he stumbled across a 1924 stamped oxygen cylinder. This was about 66 feet higher than where Sandy's ice axe was found in 1933. You know when you give up a goal but then something happens that tells you to hang in there? This discovery reignited the search in Eric's mind. With two key pieces of gear showing up pretty close to each other, Eric started thinking the same thing the 1933 expedition had suggested. This had to be the spot where George and Sandy's climb took a tragic turn. And given the mountain's steep slope, it looked like they could have slipped and fallen a crazy distance. Maybe even in the same area where that Chinese climber said he saw a body back in 1975. Eric returned to Everest in 1999, leading the second Mallory and Irvine research expedition to investigate further. And that's when the most significant find in this case came to light. On May 1, 1999, 4 expedition climbers discovered a body in a dip in the slope at 26,700 feet that was around 1,000 feet below and 330 feet to the side of where the ice axe had been found. Since they thought the axe belonged to Sandy, they figured this body had to be his too. The climbers found the body's waist still looped with rope, showing severe hemorrhaging from what looked like a harsh rope jerk injury. However, compared to other victims who'd fallen all the way from the northeast ridge, this guy's injuries weren't that bad, which made them think he survived the first fall, but got hit with some bad luck afterward. A golf ball-sized puncture in his forehead appeared to be the cause of death. The team began piecing together the story. They believed the climber, thought to be Sandy, had slipped and fallen near the spot where his ice axe was found back in 1933. Unable to stop himself, he likely had to slide further down the steep terrain. To slow his descent, he probably dragged his ice axe behind him, a technique climbers call a glissade. However, a rock may have deflected the axe, causing it to fatally strike him in the head. So for a while, everything lined up for Sandy, until one of the team members spotted the collar of his torn jacket. It had George Mallory stitched on it, not Sandy Irvine. That's when they realized they'd actually found George's body instead. This unexpected twist gave us 3 possible theories. Theory 1. The body was Sandy's, but he wore George's jacket, explaining the ice axe mix-up. Theory 2. The ice axe found in 1933 wasn't Sandy's, but George's, and the body was George's too. Theory 3. George and Sandy were roped together when they fell. George ended up where they found him, but Sandy fell elsewhere. DNA testing confirmed the body was definitely George Mallory, which ruled out the first one. Plus, George's wife had already denied recognizing the ice axe, so that shot down the second possibility as well. So, what they were left with was the third one. Maybe the two were roped together when the whole thing went south. While it made a lot of sense how the situation could have gone down, the big question still remained. Did the duo actually make it to the summit, or not? The research team found 2 pieces of evidence that suggested they might have made it. First, George had been carrying a photo of his wife, planning to leave it at the summit when he got there. But no photo was found on his body, which meant that he might have actually reached the summit and left it there. The second clue came from his snow goggles, which were found in his pocket. This suggested he had died at night, and that he and Sandy were probably making their summit push late in the day and had been coming back down when things went wrong. Both of these could have been backed up if the team had found his pocket camera, but George didn't have one, so it was likely Sandy who had both cameras. And once again, everything came down to finding Sandy's body, and hopefully the cameras with it, to figure out exactly what happened to these 2 guys. Over the years, there have been a bunch of half-hearted claims about people spotting Sandy's body, but none of them were solid enough to launch a full-blown search. However, as the 21st century rolled in, things started to take some unexpected turns. One of the major developments was the impact of global warming and climate change on Mount Everest. Data shows that in the past 30 years, the average temperature on Everest has increased by about 0.3 to 0.5 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. While this might seem small, it's causing long-term issues like melting glaciers and shifting mountain structures. However, it's also been a surprising help in solving this 100-year-old mystery. As the weather changes and glaciers shift, more and more bodies that were buried under layers of snow are starting to surface. Mountaineers, high-altitude porters, and rescue teams are noticing these remains popping up faster than usual, and it's only expected to increase in the future. Which brings us full circle to the present. The latest and most shocking discovery came in late September 2024, when National Geographic photographer and director Jimmy Chin was leading his crew down the central Rongbuk Glacier. They stumbled upon an oxygen bottle marked with the date 1933. The oxygen bottle turned out to be from the same British Everest expedition that had discovered Sandy's ice axe. Jimmy had a gut feeling that, with the mountain melting and revealing old layers, there might be more things from that time buried nearby. He wondered if Sandy's body could finally be among those remains, now coming to light after all these years. Though it seemed like a long shot, Jimmy's guess was surprisingly right. Jimmy figured that if the oxygen tank had been exposed because of a glacier shift, it probably ended up much farther down than a body would have since the tank was lighter. He started thinking that Sandy's remains might be somewhere a few hundred yards up the glacier. So, over the next few days, Jimmy and his team took a winding route, carefully navigating the glacier's folds and crevasses. Finally, one of his crew members spotted a boot poking out from the ice, which they figured had probably just melted out in the last week. Inside the boot was a broken-off human foot still in a sock, with a name tape that read A.C. Irvine. Jimmy carefully carried the boot and foot off the mountain in a cooler and handed it over to the authorities for DNA testing. I can't imagine the atmosphere on that team, knowing they'd found such an incredible piece of history. No wonder they were running around dropping F-bombs. This discovery obviously adds a crucial update in figuring out what really happened to George and Sandy. While Jimmy hasn't shared the exact spot where they found it, it was about 7,000 feet below where George's body was located. That pretty much suggests that both climbers might have fallen in that same area, but then avalanches and snowstorms likely swept Sandy's body away, burying it under snow and breaking it apart before it ended up where it was found. It's also a huge step forward in the search for more clues. Jimmy is hopeful they might uncover more pieces of evidence, or maybe even the cameras from the area nearby. Experts from Kodak think there's a solid chance that the black and white film in those cameras could still be developed into usable images because of the way the film's chemicals react to freezing temperatures. This means we're closer than ever to solving the biggest mystery in the history of Mount Everest. Jimmy and his team are still on the hunt for those cameras. They could hold photos proving whether George and Sandy reached the summit. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.